The sun hung heavy over the large plantation, creating long shadows across the cotton fields. The sound of distant whistles filled the air like a constant reminder of power. Overseer Samuel Hargrove, a man of harsh words and cruel control, ruled the estate with complete power. His wife Margaret was no better. She hated the enslaved people, treating them as nothing more than tools for work, objects for her own fun and cruelty. Yet on this plantation, the balance of power was about to be broken in a way that would shake its foundation forever. 10 men and women, held by years of suffering and silent anger, had watched and waited. They knew the house's rhythms, the patterns of weakness, the times when Margaret would be vulnerable, and they knew something else. She, like so many before her, had underestimated the strength of those she thought beneath her. In one decisive moment, the tables would turn. Margaret, the cruel overseer's wife, would be taken not as an object of desire, but as a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the world she had helped build. What happened next would leave the plantation forever changed, its people forever marked by the act of payback that none could have predicted. Before we begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from right now? What time is it? And can you imagine standing witness to an act so bold that it would forever change the balance of power? Drop a comment below. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried for years in whispers, fear, and unspoken defiance. The sun rose slowly over the Darnell plantation, casting golden light over fields where the enslaved people worked under the watch of the overseers. Samuel Hargrove, a tall man with eyes that saw only what he wished to, stood on the porch of his estate looking over the scene with a cold, distant satisfaction. The crack of the whip echoed through the fields as his voice rang out, commanding the workers to move faster, harder, and with more efficiency. Margaret, his wife, stood beside him, her posture stiff, her expression one of superiority. She was no stranger to cruelty after all. She had been raised to command, to control, and to put others down. The enslaved were beneath her, and she made sure they knew it. It was a game of power she played daily, mocking the workers with cutting remarks, forcing them to serve her wishes and treating them as if they were less than human. In the mansion, the fancy surroundings only made worse the cruelty that lived within it. Servants, both enslaved and free, moved silently through the halls, careful not to make a sound in case they were noticed. But there were 10 who moved with purpose, their actions calculated and deliberate, their spirits quietly planning the unthinkable. These were the slaves who had suffered under Margaret's disrespect, the ones who had endured years of neglect, abuse, and embarrassment at her hands. They had been quiet for so long, working in the fields, serving in the house, bending under the weight of mistreatment. But the years of brutality had created a bond between them, one of shared suffering, of unspoken defiance. They had seen the look in Margaret's eyes when she passed them by, heard the cruel commands she shouted without regret, and they had quietly decided, no more. The leader of the group was Che, a strong, silent man who had witnessed too much cruelty to remain passive. He was the glue that held them together, the one who had kept their spirits up during the darkest moments. He was the one who had seen the weakness in the way the overseers and masters moved, who had studied their patterns and learned their fears. As the day wore on, Che watched Margaret from a distance. She was in the garden now, fussing over the flowers with the delicate grace of someone who thought herself untouchable. The other slaves around her moved like shadows, too afraid to even look at her. But Che knew that this was the moment, the time when the delicate web of power and mistreatment would be ripped apart by the sheer force of their shared will. Margaret's pride blinded her to the danger in the air. She had never truly seen the enslaved as people, as equals. They were simply tools, nothing more. Her mocking smile, the way she looked down on them, made the decision for Che and the others. They would rise not out of meanness, but out of a deep, undeniable need for dignity. The first step in their plan had been taken. They had waited for this day, watching for the perfect moment to strike. Each of them was prepared not just for the consequences, but for the freedom that waited on the other side of this act. It would not be an act of simple revenge. No, this would be something more, a statement, a breaking of the chains that had kept them held down for so long. But even as the plan began to unfold, Che felt the weight of what would follow. Margaret's cruelty had been the source of endless suffering, but her downfall would ripple through the plantation, forever changing everything. The balance of power was about to shift, and the fear of punishment hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. For now, though, the plan had only just begun, and the first step was simple. Margaret, the overseer's wife, would be taken. The plantation would never be the same again. The days leading up to their act of defiance were marked by an unsettling calm. The plantation continued its usual rhythm, overseers shouting orders, slaves working beneath the harsh weight of the sun, the crack of whips cutting through the air like an unbroken chant of control. But for Che and his companions, every moment was spent in careful planning, observing, waiting. They had learned to move with silence and precision, and their time was coming. In the dark of night, in the quiet corners of the slave quarters, Che gathered his group. 10 faces, 10 men and women whose suffering had been linked for years, their fates bound by the same cruelty and injustice, now stood together in shared purpose. They had all witnessed Margaret's abuses, her casual cruelty, her dismissive pride, her disregard for the humanity of those she saw only as labor. Each had been broken, bent under her whip and her words, but now they were no longer afraid. Now they had a plan that would make her remember their names, their faces, and their humanity. "We can't afford mistakes," Che said, his voice low but firm. "Tomorrow, when she is alone, we will strike. We know her patterns, her weakness. We'll use it against her." The others nodded. Their faces were a mixture of fear, determination, and anticipation. They had spent weeks watching Margaret's every move, understanding her pride, her vanity. She believed herself untouchable, isolated in her sense of privilege, convinced that her beauty and the protection of her husband kept her beyond blame. She never thought the slaves, her property, her inferiors, would ever dare rise up against her. One by one, Che went over the details of the plan. It was simple, almost elegant in its execution. The first step was to separate Margaret from her usual circle of comfort. The house was large, with sprawling gardens and isolated areas where she often wandered alone, enjoying her temporary escape from the eyes of her husband and the overseers. It was there, in the privacy of her own world, that they would strike. "Listen to me," Che continued, his eyes steady on each of them. "We take her where she feels safe. That's the key. She'll never suspect us. She's always looked down on us, treated us like dirt beneath her feet. Now it's time for her to realize we're not the tools she thinks we are." Lydia, a quiet but strong woman, spoke up. "We must be swift. If we're caught, it won't just be us that suffers. Everyone will pay the price. This has to be clean." Che nodded, the weight of the plan pressing down on him. He had never intended for things to grow as they had, but there was no turning back now. The truth was, this wasn't just about revenge for the countless hours of work, the brutal punishments, or the dehumanizing insults. It was about something deeper, dignity, a reclaiming of their humanity. In the days prior, they had woven the threads of the plan into their routines. While working in the fields, they would casually drop hints and rumors, sowing discord and confusion among the overseers. They would give the impression of being obedient, compliant, anything to lull suspicion into ease. And Margaret, always so self-assured, never thought twice about any of them. She continued with her proud strolls, her scornful glances, her shallow gestures of disdain. Now everything was set. The moment she would be taken was drawing near, and with it, the first step toward overturning the power that had bound them all for so long. That night the air was thick with anticipation. In the dim light of the quarters, Che spoke with the finality of a man who had decided his fate. "Tomorrow, when she's in the garden, we make our move. We will take her, and we will make her remember. But remember this, she's not the only one who has underestimated us. The whole plantation will know what happens when they treat us as less than human." The others shared quiet nods, their faces set with determination. Fear was there, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was the fear that comes with taking control, with finally acting on the anger and injustice that had been building for so long. But they knew that this moment, this defiance, would change everything. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light over the plantation, the slaves were already in position, moving with the purpose of men and women who had been silent too long. Their steps were light, their movements synchronized as they took their places in the shadows. And then, as the first rays of sunlight touched the garden, Margaret emerged as always, unaware. She walked with the grace of someone who thought herself untouchable, her mind far removed from the world of suffering she had so casually forced on others. The moment had arrived. The morning was misleadingly peaceful as Margaret Hargrove walked through the lush gardens surrounding her mansion. The soft rustling of the trees and the distant hum of insects were the only sounds that accompanied her steps. She moved with an air of indifference, enjoying the brief solitude before her usual routine of idle gossip and disrespectful remarks to the enslaved workers. This was her moment of calm, where she could escape the limits of the house and the responsibilities of her husband's estate. She walked slowly, admiring the colorful blooms she had arranged herself, enjoying the scent of the flowers that had been carefully grown by the enslaved hands she so casually ignored. The irony was lost on her as she smiled at the rows of roses and tulips, pleased with the display of beauty and order that contrasted with the chaos of labor that existed just beyond the gates of her own small world. Unknown to Margaret, 10 sets of eyes watched her every move. The enslaved workers, who had been reduced to mere tools in the grand machinery of her life, now moved with quiet, calculated precision. They were shadows in the garden, blending seamlessly with the plants, waiting for the moment when the fancy world Margaret had created for herself would come crashing down. Che, positioned just behind a large bush near the edge of the garden, gave the signal, a subtle nod to the others, and they began to move. Their footsteps were silent on the soft earth, their bodies low and quick, knowing the timing was everything. The plan had been rehearsed in whispered words and careful actions over the past few days, each detail carefully thought out to ensure that Margaret would never see it coming. Margaret, unaware of the approaching danger, bent down to admire a particular rosebush, her fingers lightly brushing the petals. It was a moment of rare vulnerability. Her pride and comfort with the plantation's rhythms had left her unaware of the silent storm that had been brewing just beneath the surface. Suddenly the air shifted and she became aware of a presence behind her. She straightened, her heart skipping a beat as she turned to face the sound. But before she could react, strong hands grabbed her from behind, pulling her into the grip of the waiting slaves. Her scream was cut short as she was dragged backward, her body thrown against the cold, unforgiving ground. She tried to fight, her movements frantic, but the strength of the 10 enslaved men and women was overwhelming. Margaret had never truly realized the depth of their power. She had never believed they could rise up against her, against the system she and her husband had so carefully built. Her mind raced, fear mixing with disbelief. How could this be happening? She was a mistress of the house, untouchable, above blame. But now, in the quiet garden with the soft sunlight falling on the scene like a cruel reminder, she was nothing but a woman, vulnerable, terrified, and out of control. Che, standing tall and calm, moved closer. His voice was steady, almost calm, despite the intensity of the situation. "You've never seen us as people, Margaret," he said, his tone carrying the weight of years of suffering. "You've never cared for us, never treated us as human beings. But we remember. And now we will make you remember." Margaret's eyes widened in fear as she struggled against the grip of the other slaves. "You," she gasped, her voice shaking. "You'll pay for this. My husband, he'll—" But Chase silenced her with a sharp gesture. "Your husband is no help to you now," he said, his voice cold with finality. "This is between us, Margaret. You've made us suffer for years. Now you will feel the weight of your cruelty." The overseers had been distracted by the morning chores, unaware of the unfolding drama in the garden. The cries of the enslaved workers had gone unnoticed, and even now, as Margaret struggled, no one came to her aid. Che moved with deliberate force, using his body to steady her while the others positioned themselves, ensuring Margaret was fully under their control. Her body shook with fear, her pride shattered as she realized there was no escape. The reality of the situation set in. Her authority, her cruelty had led her to this very moment. Margaret tried once more to scream, her voice raw with panic, but her cries were muted as one of the enslaved men placed a hand over her mouth, silencing her entirely. The garden, once a symbol of beauty and order, had become the stage for a reckoning. Che stepped back, surveying the scene. The others held Margaret firmly in place, ensuring she could not escape or fight back. The entire plantation had become an unwilling audience to this act of defiance, and the power dynamics that had been so rigidly enforced for years were unraveling in a single, irreversible moment. "We are not what you thought we were," Che continued, his voice unwavering. "And today you will see the price of your pride. You will know the power of those you believed beneath you." Margaret's eyes burned with fear and embarrassment, but the reality of the situation settled into her bones. She had crossed a line, and now there would be no turning back. The cruelty she had shown, the disregard for their humanity, it would be met with something she could not control, an act of payback that shook the foundations of the plantation she had always ruled over. The tension in the air was suffocating. Margaret Hargrove, a woman who had once ruled the plantation with cruelty and privilege, now lay powerless, surrounded by the very people she had spent years dehumanizing. Her body trembled beneath the weight of the 10 enslaved men and women who held her firmly, their strength greater than any of the authority she had commanded over them. In the garden, once a place of beauty and pride, her world had unraveled, exposing her vulnerability and her complete lack of control. Che, standing at the center of the scene, watched her with cold eyes. His heart, once filled with a quiet longing for justice, now burned with a fierce determination. The years of suffering under Margaret's eyes, the countless hours of embarrassment, the pain of watching her show off her power, all of it had led to this single moment. Now it was his turn to make her see what it felt like to be truly powerless. Margaret's eyes darted from face to face, desperation flooding her every nerve. You can't do this. My husband will kill you," she hissed, her voice trembling with panic. "You'll be punished, I'll make sure of it." Che's lips curved into a faint smile, the bitterness of her words lost on him. "Your husband is nowhere to be found," he said calmly, his voice as smooth as the river that ran beyond the garden. "This is between you and us, you and the people you have tormented." Margaret's body jerked against the grip that held her down. She tried to pull away, but the pressure on her arms and legs only tightened. The overwhelming realization that she was completely helpless sank in. No longer the mistress of the house, no longer in control. The people she had considered less than human now had complete control over her fate. The enslaved workers, led by Che, stood motionless around her, their faces a mix of determination and quiet dignity. The air was thick with the weight of their shared resolve. The silence between Margaret's words of outrage and the slave's unyielding presence stretched painfully long, each second adding to her growing horror. "You've made a living by making us suffer, Margaret," Che continued, his gaze unwavering. "You've treated us like tools, like animals. But today you will feel what it means to be nothing, to be controlled by the very people you've tried to break." Her frantic eyes locked on his, her mouth moving as if to protest, but no words came. The sound of her breath, shallow and panicked, filled the space where her usual cutting remarks had once fallen. The slave's grip tightened, not in anger, but in determination. They had suffered for too long. The punishment they had endured had been constant, ever present. But this moment, this act would change everything. The roles had shifted. Power had been claimed, not by force, but by the sheer will of those who had been denied it. And in that moment, the slaves did not simply overpower her. They stripped her of her humanity in the most intimate way possible. She had reduced them to nothing for years. Now they would make her realize what it felt like to be powerless, to be dehumanized in the most humiliating of ways. The heat of the moment was unbearable. Margaret's frantic resistance grew weaker as the reality of her position set in. She was no longer a mistress, no longer in authority. She was a woman caught in the web of her own cruelty, exposed to the very acts of revenge she had long carried out against others. The sun above them shone relentlessly, its light making the scene seem almost unreal. The bright garden, the stillness of the enslaved workers, and the trembling, desperate figure of Margaret beneath them. The garden that had once been her territory, her sanctuary, now felt like a prison of her own making. Her struggle began to slow, the realization dawning on her fully. This was not a mere revolt. This was the ultimate rebellion. The slaves were not just seeking payback for the years of torment. They were reclaiming what had been stolen from them, their dignity, their control, their humanity. And Margaret, helpless beneath them, was now the one who would know what it felt like to be powerless. Che stepped forward, his expression calm, but there was a fire in his eyes, an unspoken promise that would echo through the halls of the plantation for years to come. "This is not just for us, Margaret," he said softly. "This is for all those who came before us, all those who suffered in silence, in pain, and in fear. This is for them, too." Margaret's eyes, wide with fear, flicked to the faces of the slaves who held her, the realization crashing down. These were the very people she had broken, and now they were the ones who would decide her fate. She had underestimated them all, and in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. Her body slumped, her head hanging in a final surrender. The power that had once been her birthright, that had kept her above the others, was gone. In its place stood the quiet, unstoppable force of resistance. The morning after Margaret's embarrassment, the air on the Darnell plantation was thick with the smell of panic and disbelief. The once unquestioned authority of the Hargrove household had been shattered, and the ripples of the slaves' defiance spread quickly, though not in the way the masters had expected. Samuel Hargrove, the overseer, returned from a brief trip to the neighboring estate. His brow wrinkled in concern. He had heard nothing but rumors, whispers of a strange, unsettling incident in the garden and the disappearance of his wife. When he first arrived, he could not bring himself to believe what had happened. Margaret was missing. His house, his sanctuary, had been violated. His wife, the woman who had ruled over the plantation with disrespect for the enslaved, was nowhere to be found. Panic gripped him as he rushed to the garden, searching frantically for any sign of her. The slaves working in the fields moved like shadows, their eyes avoiding his as they continued their labor. It wasn't until he reached the garden that he saw the evidence. Margaret's personal belongings were scattered on the ground. Her dress, once perfect, now torn and trampled in the dirt. Her perfume lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the power she had once wielded. Samuel's heart raced, his mind clouded with anger and confusion. The embarrassment of his wife was unbearable. How had this happened? Who had dared to do this? The overseers gathered, sensing the change in the air, though none of them dared to speak too loudly. They had heard the rumors, and their suspicions were growing. The slaves had become more than just obedient workers. They had become something else, something more dangerous. Samuel's voice cracked through the silence. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" But no one answered. No one dared. In the quarters, the enslaved workers moved with a quiet sense of relief. They had won, at least for now. The fear that had gripped them for so long, that had kept them obedient and controlled, had begun to fade. They no longer feared the whip or the cruel words of the overseers, not in the same way. The power dynamics had shifted, and the act of rebellion they had carried out was becoming a forbidden legend, one that would haunt the Hargrove family forever. Che, standing among the others, knew that the consequences would be severe. The plantation would fight back, but for now, they had tasted something sweeter than fear. Freedom in its most rebellious form. They had taken something from the Hargroves that could never be given back, their sense of control, their sense of superiority. And the slaves had not just taken revenge, they had redefined their place in this world. The overseers, uncertain of how to proceed, glanced nervously at each other. Samuel, in his fury, had yet to speak of punishment, but they could feel it coming like a storm gathering on the horizon. They too were bound by the fragile hierarchy of the plantation, and any disruption to that order was a threat to their own authority. They could not afford to lose control. Meanwhile, back in the house, Samuel Hargrove stood in front of his wife's empty chambers, rage building inside him. His mind reeled with thoughts of revenge, of how to punish the slaves who had dared to challenge him, who had defied the power of the master's household. His thoughts turned to the overseers, to the whip, to the chains that had once kept the enslaved in line. The punishment would be swift, he decided. There would be no mercy. But as he stood there, the weight of the situation settled on him like a heavy cloak. He had no answers, no explanations, only a hollow sense of powerlessness and fear. For the first time in his life, he realized how fragile his world was. He had taken for granted the power he wielded, the unquestioned obedience of those beneath him. But now that world was crumbling. The whispers among the enslaved grew louder. The news of Margaret's fate spread like wildfire, crossing the boundaries of the Darnell estate and reaching neighboring plantations. It became a forbidden legend, a tale of defiance that could not be told aloud but was carried in hushed tones. The rebellion had been quiet, subtle, but it was no less powerful for its restraint. What had started as an act of payback had become a message, one that would travel far beyond the walls of the Hargrove plantation. The enslaved had been pushed to their limits, and now they had risen, not just against their masters, but against the very system that had kept them chained for so long. And though the storm of punishment loomed, the power of what had happened could not be undone. The Darnell plantation had been shaken to its core, and the world would never see it the same way again. The Darnell plantation stood silent in the aftermath of the rebellion. The once carefully maintained fields, the grand mansion, and the well-organized house were now wrapped in a clear fear, a fear that neither Samuel Hargrove nor his overseers could control. The slaves had broken more than just the physical chains they had been bound with. They had shattered the illusion of power, exposing the fragile nature of their master's control. In the days that followed, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. Samuel Hargrove, unable to reclaim his sense of control, resorted to the only tactic he knew: punishment. He ordered the public whipping of a few enslaved workers who had been near the scene, attempting to set an example. His voice, once commanding, now wavered with the uncertainty of a man who could no longer demand the obedience he once took for granted. His attempts to reassert control were useless, as the knowledge of the rebellion spread like wildfire. But the punishment only deepened the divide. The enslaved people, once so easily controlled by fear, now saw the reality of their own power. They had taken a stand, and though they had not yet fully escaped the chains of mistreatment, they had made their voices heard in a way that could never be silenced. The whispers of defiance, of rebellion, had spread beyond the boundaries of Darnell's estate, carried to neighboring plantations, where others began to talk of what had been done. For the enslaved, the act had become more than just an act of revenge. It was proof of their ability to rise up when pushed beyond their limits. Margaret's embarrassment, the very event that had marked the shift in power, was now an untold legend, one that could not be erased, no matter how much the masters tried to punish it. Meanwhile, Che, the leader of the 10 who had taken Margaret, became a figure of quiet respect among the enslaved. His courage and his unwavering determination had inspired them all. Yet despite the respect he commanded, he knew the cost of their defiance. The punishment would come. The master's anger was relentless, and the price for their rebellion would likely be high. But for Che, the satisfaction of seeing Margaret brought low, her authority stripped away, and her cruelty exposed was a victory in itself. As weeks turned into months, the consequences of that single act of defiance became clear. The Darnell plantation, though still working, was forever changed. The once unquestioned authority of Samuel Hargrove had crumbled, leaving behind a scar of fear and uncertainty. The overseers, who had once been able to create terror in the hearts of the enslaved with a glance, now found themselves cautiously watching every corner, unsure of who they could trust. Across the plantation, a sense of unity grew. The enslaved workers spoke in hushed tones of the act of defiance, of Che's leadership, and of the shared courage that had shaken their world. They knew that their position was dangerous, that the masters would exact punishment, but there was a shared understanding that their spirits could not be broken. The impact of that day rippled through the nearby estates, carried on the whispers of slaves who had heard the story and believed it to be true. And while the masters clung to their power, they knew deep down that something had changed forever. The system of slavery, built on fear and submission, had been shaken to its core. In the end, the Hargrove plantation remained, but its soul was fractured. Samuel and Margaret's reputations were forever damaged. The workers on the estate, once frightened and broken, now moved with a quiet pride, no longer mere servants but defiant individuals who had reclaimed a piece of their humanity. And the story of Margaret's fall, the act of payback and power that had taken place in the garden, would live on in hushed tones and quiet respect for generations to come. The legacy of that day was not just one of revenge, but one of courage. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could rise, unbroken and defiant. And the masters who once believed their power was absolute would never again see the enslaved as mere property. They would always remember the moment when the balance of power had shifted forever.